So Coffee Talk is supposed to be a fun thing to balance the seriousness of legit interviews, to keep the channel alive in between legit interviews, and hopefully while fun, it has more substance than most similar podcasts. Does this count as a podcast? I don't know. So in what happens every seemingly 5 years or so, I call it the Pentecost effect, referencing the famous Don Pentecost work, put them down, take them out. There are certain works or systems that inherently, if they associate themselves with certain topics or groups, it's an automatic, you're one of the cool kids type of thing. Well, sometimes people utilize that methodology or set of methodologies from a good-hearted place of wanting to help protect people against that element. And there's nothing more admirable, but I've got some concerns. For example, my use of reverse edge methods is in the event that you're about to be put into a van, in which case that's against an unarmed person, and you have the legal right to do so. While most of these concepts are very easy to learn, reverse edge methods against a person with a knife at this range is the hardest thing to pull off without incurring the same damage to yourself in the process. There's only one guy I've ever seen that I was like, well, yeah, I think they could do that. And their last name is Douglas. And there's only one of them, and we're talking guessing 10, 15, probably lifelong practitioner of the martial arts. This talk is also generally about fraudulence, intentional or unintentional, but there's sort of a sliding scale of that. Say on this end we have our legitimate practitioners of the martial art who are willing to get their hands dirty to some degree. And then on the other side you have the scale of fraudulence, and on the farthest end is outright frauds who lie about their acumen and who don't want to put in the work at all. And so they completely make it up and they print something out. And, okay, well, right up against, right when you're about to cross into actual, real knowledge, there's some people right here who look at something look at YouTube videos with their eyes, and they try and do those techniques, and then those techniques don't work. And so then they just trash the system. Does that mean the techniques don't work? Does that mean that the people in the videos are all programmed to just, go along in the McDojo sense? Not necessarily. It could just mean that from your perception, you don't understand what you're looking at. So it's sort of like those people in our lives that we all have who are real jerks, and they joke about the fact that, yeah, I know I'm a jerk. And they admit this about themselves, and they feel that that makes it okay. It's like a pseudo-humility is what it is, where they openly admit their lack of acumen and justify it with, oh, all that other stuff, that really hard stuff, it doesn't work. So I don't need it. Nothing works in self-defense. And we talk about that. But to circle back around, there is something to be said for being a lifelong practitioner, or however many years, for getting your hands dirty and doing the work. And there's also no substitute for it, even if it's totally just your own thing. Probably the most important part of the talk was honoring and respecting each other and the importance of that. So without further ado. Welcome to Coffee Talk. I'm your host, Chris, as always. My co-host today is Phil once again. For those of you that don't know, Phil is a longtime martial artist with quite an acumen of both Filipino, Indonesian influenced, and essentially Chinese martial arts, Kung Fu, more or less. And so I asked him to be a co-host today again because I want to talk about not a fad, but another wave in the trends that seems to come around every 5 to 10 years that we've seen a resurgence of, and that is prison-based martial arts. And well, let's start with something that you have looked at a lot, and that is the system called 52 blocks. That is what it's called, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What can you give us? Because I know next to nothing.
The problem with calling 52 blocks a system is that it wasn't, even though it is.
Okay.
And by that I mean, when people first started talking about 52 blocks, there was this elaborate mythology attributed to it, wherein supposedly 52 blocks was a prison-based martial arts system that had been handed down inside the prison system from prisoner to prisoner, and eventually had gotten out. So it's not like everyone who is a 52 blocks practitioner necessarily has a direct link to the prison system. You know, they learned from someone else who
Mhm.
did, something like that. And then I've even seen the mythology go as far back as, well, this was a system handed down from slaves
Yes.
who, passed it on to other people who ended up in the prison system, and it promulgated there. And the problem with all of those assertions is, one, there is no discrete system. There's no body of techniques you can point to and say that this is definitively 52 blocks, but this isn't, because everyone you talk to is different, and there are certain prominent practitioners of 52 blocks, people like Light Burley and other sort of exponents of the system, who will tell you the system involves this or the system involves that. But there are other people you talk to, and it could range. It looks like anything from a very sloppy boxing technique to something involving like trapping and almost Jeet Kune Do, to everything in between. So it's very hard to pin down. It is in some ways a very amorphous blob of a body of techniques that gets applied to certain methodologies. And the same could be said for, like, say, Krav Maga. Krav Maga is essentially a catch-all term for literally any martial arts that someone from Israel seems to be doing at this moment.
Yeah.
So to say that a
Ooh.
body of techniques is or is not Krav Maga is really hard to pin down. And there may be some general similarities across the different people performing under that banner. So 52 blocks is in much the same way, very hard to define. I wrote an article that got a lot of grief down through the years because I said, look, 52 blocks does not exist. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't people today claiming to teach it. I'm saying that as a system, it is simply not believable or credible to think that a body of discrete techniques were passed down from person to person from pre-slavery times to now, or even from earlier from now in the prison system. Do prisoners learn bad things from each other? Certainly they do. But there is no such thing as a coherent body of techniques or systems being taught from prisoner to prisoner, because it just isn't that formal. It's just not that way.
All right.
And the reason
Yeah.
so much of it ends up looking like sloppy boxing or dirty boxing, as it's often termed, is because boxing is what people do when left to their own devices. Boxing is how people
True.
fight each other.
Yeah. True.
So, if you took some people who'd never heard of martial arts in any way, lived in some sort of vacuum where nobody had ever been taught anything about crashing their fists into each other, and you
Yeah.
gave them cause to fight, eventually what they would end up doing would look a lot like boxing. I'm pretty
Yeah.
much convinced. Or maybe even Greco-Roman wrestling, which is the same type of thing.
Okay. So it's interesting what you brought up Krav Maga and Israel, and something I have noticed amongst different, and the martial arts are absolutely no different. You'll find this in products and in everything. It's probably, this is a two-part thing. It's probably unintentional, uh, but projecting the deepest components of, in this case, historical Black identity and culture within that individual, at least, and then forming, probably unbeknownst to himself, an external dichotomy of importance, and then enshrining the pedigree of his art, especially if it's made up, within that pedigree that is formed from a projection of heritage. Now
I don't know
that's
if you heard that dinosaur noise just now. That was the dog out in the hallway. He makes this noise that sounds like a Tyrannosaurus Rex going. Roar. It's every once in a while he just goes. Roar.
it was either that or you have a pet velociraptor now. I don't know. But
Yeah, it's he's a chocolate lab and he's just out in the hallway going.
that's
Roar. He does it
is he
every so
okay?
often.
Is
Yeah,
he okay?
it's something to do with. He's
Oh,
like, it's like the equivalent of clearing his throat.
Okay.
But he's in the hallway very close to the office door right now because it's cooler in there. He likes to lie on the wood floor where it's cooler because it's warm
Oh,
outside right
okay.
now.
Hmm.
So,
Uh, and so that's best case scenario. I'm saying that the original or the guy that I have mostly seen uh, popularizing or going on about 52 blocks, kind of the head guy right now, one of the head guys, who is a black individual. Possibly unbeknownst to himself, he has done that, and then okay, and so that's essentially part and parcel of the system. Is it's directly integral to the perception of his culture. What I have seen is people from different cultures, not just black individuals, certainly, they will knowingly, and here's where it turns not ideal, they will knowingly draw such a correlation from the past to the present with a product, with a recipe, or anything that they know is going to automatically garner other people of their same culture that care about that thing for the sole, just for the culture part, not the efficacy of, in this case, the martial art to actually protect you. And fair enough, right? Because how cool is it that you're supposedly getting in touch with an ancestral art? Okay, well, therefore, that makes it, if done knowingly, if you're just playing on people's love of their culture and you're making something up with that as a part of it, that makes it genuinely psychopathic level deceptive because it's a form of cultural predation. Hang on, hang on. Because it's lying to people about something that they take very, very seriously. And as you like to say, frauds matter. Frauds in martial arts do
yeah,
matter, and that's why.
I don't I don't know if I would characterize it as psychopathy or as a predation though, because every culture and every interest area is uh, can be affected by the desire to link to something from the past. Links to history are very powerful. So, for example, modern neo-paganism and Wicca, depending on who you talk to, it either has descended in an unbroken line from pre-Christian times, or it was essentially invented by Gerald Gardner in the 1960s and then promulgated from followers of him and offshoots of what he started from there. Now, enough time has gone by since the 60s. I mean, that's a considerable amount of time for
Yeah.
this tradition, whether it's a recreation or whether it's linked to the past. Either way, there are people who find meaning in that and value in that. So it's not that any one culture has cornered the market on trying to lay claim to the past. I started to say before, I it was at one time it was called Afrocentrism. I think some people will even go so far as to call it black supremacy, although I don't think that's the intent here. There are
No.
people who will try to link they will try to link things to African history that don't actually go there. And the debate about the Netflix film about Cleopatra is one such thing. There are people saying, Cleopatra, she's a
Right.
black actress in this documentary, and there are people who say, well, Cleopatra was Greek, and so she shouldn't have dark skin. And of course, Netflix is kind of a running gag because didn't they do a documentary about Anne Boleyn and they cast a black actress just to
Yeah.
do it for no other reason than to do it? It's like what's that musical about the founding fathers? Hamilton, is
Hamilton.
it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the whole thing is they're black actors. No one's claiming the founding fathers were black. It's just that this is what we did for this musical.
Yeah. They just
So
so happen to be, yeah.
yeah, so there's many different ways to look at what you could characterize as cultural appropriation, although I don't like that term because I don't believe cultures own things.
Right.
Um, and the desire to link historically things that don't go with the history of any given region of the world. So the stories about Yasuke, or however you pronounce his name, the supposed black samurai, most of those are largely fictitious. Yasuke was not an actual samurai who fought with a samurai sword, etc., etc., even though you'll see viral post after viral post about how he was. So uh, I don't think I would not. I would hesitate to attribute any kind of a nefarious motive to people trying to assign a history to 52 blocks But I
Right.
do think in many cases their reach exceeds their grasp. I think that there's a lot of claims made about the history of the system that simply aren't supportable. But people make those systems because they're essentially declaring a political affiliation, an affiliation with an ideology,
Mhm.
which they have therefore a motivation to support in the absence of actual real evidence of this system being handed down in coherent fashion. I mean, I would challenge any group of 10 52 blocks practitioners who didn't know each other to show me the system and have their systems be the same. I doubt they would be,
Yeah.
except insofar as sloppy boxing looks like sloppy boxing.
Right. Well, I'm not saying across the board. That's why I made the very poorly, sloppily tried to delineate the two in the context you just told me. Absolutely, and it's generally, I think, a good thing. And if you're unknowingly doing that, then fine. But what I'm saying is, I have known people who have bragged about it, that they will attribute cultural, they will use cultural supposed history that they know is not true. And they're doing that because they know that I can automatically have access and interest from this cultural group of people in my immediate area. And so it's manipulation. It's maybe not psychopathic, but it's definitely manipulative if you lie knowingly for the sole reason of basically preying upon your own culture in your immediate vicinity. So that's not a very couth thing to do.
Well,
That's all
we've
I would
seen
say.
exactly the same trend. In the 1980s, the ninja craze was exactly this. It was people who had done nothing but, garden variety Japanese martial arts were suddenly putting on black uniforms and face masks and, aligning themselves with ninjutsu when they had no previous ninjutsu experience and nothing really that could separate itself out. Is like if you look at the martial arts of the Bujinkan, it basically looks like jujitsu. It's a little looser, it's a little more free flowing, but its Japanese roots are apparent. What is it, Budo Taijutsu? I'm no expert on that topic. I know people who are much more knowledgeable of that, but the ninja craze in the 1980s was really one of costuming. It was, I need a black mask, I need tabby, I need a black uniform, and then I need the weapons that have been popularized in these ninja movies. The straight bladed sword and the hand claws and ninja stars. All of these things have historical analogs. It's not like they were invented from nothing in most cases, although there are people who claim the straight bladed ninja sword didn't actually exist. But really, it was this body of this is ninjutsu was invented as a unit in the 1980s. It had never existed in that grouping before. And now, 40 years later, there are people, some of whom weren't even alive when that boom hit in the 1980s, who have no reason not to believe that ninjutsu is not a coherent body of techniques that include the costumes and trappings of the 1980s, which were nothing more than entertainment. When Lee Van Cleef played a ninja in the
Yes.
movie, in the television series The Master, the whitest white man who has ever whited played a ninja, and then whenever he put his mask on and did stunts, suddenly he was Asian because the stunt man was Asian. So
Yeah.
I love that series for that reason, but it was absurd and it sort of encapsulates the rush to align with ninjutsu in a way that was simply imaginary. So you could, this trend, it's played out many times over many different topic areas where, like many of the people who donned black outfits and decided they were teaching ninjutsu, they had no link to ninjutsu either. And they most likely knew it, but they wanted in.
Okay. Then that's a perfect analogy. Um, which that's a whole nother video, the ninja stuff, man. Okay, so moving on to a system that is now maybe a little over a year old, and it is the most recent incarnation of something that supposedly hails from or was developed in or with concordance of a prison system, or prisoners, and it's called Medusa. And we both know quite a lot about it. We know the people, or I know half of the people. What do you think about it so far?
Well, it's been interesting to watch it become to develop so much momentum, because I can't remember the last time I saw something get this popular this quickly. I think when I became aware of like Piper knife fighting, suddenly it seemed like everybody was doing Piper, but that may have been just my impression, kind of like the psychological effect of when you buy a car, suddenly you see more of them on the street
Suddenly,
because you're
yeah. Well, no,
looking for them.
I think though it was pretty accurate.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm now the only person I know who isn't a certified Medusa instructor. There's been I've been seeing all kinds of people I
Yeah,
know, friends of
I know.
mine, become aligned with the system. It's really cool to see it grow. And
Yeah,
I know there's politics involved. There's no area of human endeavor that's not affected by politics, and there's no era of human endeavor quite like the knife fighting world. That seems to lend itself even more to politics. And there's a weird irony. There's probably a college paper in there somewhere about how in a, let's call it a hobby area, even though that's not really a hobby. No one's like, I will knife duel people on the weekends for fun. It's not like that. But there's no more contentious interest, I would say, than knife fighting. Like, these are people who they're doing something that involves killing people if you really get down to it, and yet they
thank
seem
you.
more likely to get into arguments with each other. And you would think it would be just the opposite. It would be a really quiet room of awkwardly polite people, knowing that
Thank
everyone's
you.
hand is
Yeah,
just
yeah.
inches away from the hilt of a knife. And that's me projecting my fantasies onto it in much the same way that, like, The Quick and the Dead, that Western with Sharon Stone, is set in a fantasy world that is much like the fantasy China of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. It bears no
Yeah,
resemblance to actual history.
sure.
So it would be easy to view the world of knife fighting through that fantasy
Well,
lens.
no, okay, if I may, you're exactly correct. That's how it should be, which tells you a lot about it tells you a lot about the overlap of certain interests with supposed knife fighting that I'm not going to get into to all. That's a whole nother video. But the
Well,
personality type is
martial arts
usually
in general.
the person, yeah, yeah. The personality type is someone seeking personal power because they don't feel they have any in real life is often the
Well,
case. And
you'll
those
see those
people,
people.
what's part and parcel of that personality type is incredible insecurity and zero, usually in spite of their supposed acumen, very little actual respect for other humans, and so they're unexplainably mouthy. And it's
Well,
like you won't catch me or Phil being that way
oh,
ever.
I don't know. I've picked a few fights over the years.
Sure, but you
I,
pick
I
them.
don't know as I have very good ground to stand on there. While I think those people are a minority, there are more of them. Their minority is larger within, like, the martial arts and then the knife subset than it is
Okay,
in other areas of human endeavor. It's
yeah,
sort of like Dungeons and Dragons will not turn your kid into a weirdo disconnected from reality, but weirdos who are disconnected from reality will be drawn to Dungeons and Dragons. There's a
no, no
hilarious
offense,
after
but
school.
yeah.
Yeah, there's a hilarious after school movie called Mazes and Monsters that features a very young Tom Hanks. And he's a boy who he's playing a game like Dungeons and Dragons, and he becomes disconnected from reality. And eventually, by the end of the film, he's seeing monsters. Like, he kills a monster only to discover he's stabbed an aggressive homeless man. Like,
Oh my
it was
goodness.
very much a cautionary tale about don't let your kid become disconnected from reality by playing
Okay.
Dungeons and Dragons. So
Well,
there's that element in the
yeah,
knife fighting world
for sure.
specifically, and the
Mhm.
martial arts generally. But fortunately, it's still the minority. The problem is that we all then must contend with the dust ups that these personality types help to spawn.
Yeah.
So the political backbiting is sort of unavoidable. All that said, I think it's also possible to avoid. Like, I watched the Medusa guys very deftly. Jason himself very shrewdly was able to tamp those down. I follow his Instagram account, and he was like,
Yeah.
"Hey, let's not do this. Hey, let's not do that. This isn't this. That isn't that." And he was really good at managing all of that. And I've been very impressed by him as a person. I interviewed him and Mike, the two co-progenitors of the system, as
Yeah.
well as Mike's son, and they did a good job of answering my questions. When I interviewed them, I didn't hold back anything. It wasn't like a bunch of softballs. I asked them, very specific questions about the genesis of the system. So it's been really fun sort of being there, being present for this system becoming a thing. It could go two ways. It could end with these guys, and the pool of these guys is getting bigger by the minute. So when all of the guys currently doing Medusa, when they are no longer with us, maybe the system's gone and it was just one of those flash in the pan things, a piece of lore that only, people like me remember, because I seem to be a repositor of that type of lore anymore, sitting here in my office.
Yeah, all they're missing is an official knife that everyone buys, and then you'll
Well,
have, yeah.
I had exactly that conversation with somebody the other day.
Oh,
I
really?
wish to hell I had purchased one of the Congress of American Knife Fighters official knives back
Oh.
when Hockheim was doing the Congress of American Knife Fighting,
Mhm.
because it was like this ridiculous eagle-headed thing. It looked like something from the United Cutlery catalog, and I wish I had it to put on my wall as a piece of knife fighting lore.
Exactly. Yeah.
The one of the knives that I keep on my wall is actually a United Cutlery Black Widow, which was disproportionately represented among people I went to college with. It was pretty much the unofficial illegal boot knife of that university, and that's why I ended up acquiring one and putting it on the wall. Which, if
Okay.
I'd been smart enough to set one aside back in the day, it wouldn't have cost me $100 to get a collectible one. But anyway, I enjoy the lore. So Medusa might disappear, or it might be that we're watching the beginning of something that, like Piper, goes on for decades after, which would
Yeah,
be really neat. Would be really neat to see.
sure.
It's not. I wouldn't call Medusa a prison-based system. Obviously, Mike and Jason and Mike's son, they compiled it with the input of prisoners that they interviewed. The idea being that they wanted it to be as expeditious as possible. The thing that characterizes felons that many people don't seem to really hook on to is that felons don't care what you think you're going to do. They have a
Yeah.
script they're going to execute, and they're just going to do it. And if you do something else, they don't care. They're going to plow right through you if they
Yeah,
can.
okay. So I'm skipping ahead way down on my notes because you went there. Um, can you please state for us, because it was great, your observation that was on a reel or a TikTok that you did about the study where people are shown two pictures, that thing. Could you please share that with us? And
Yes, they interviewed felons and prisoners or whomever, bad people, and they
Mhm.
showed them a scene involving one person victimizing another. What they found was that overwhelmingly, the prisoners only ever saw themselves as the aggressor. They never identified with the victim because they didn't see themselves as the victim. They always saw themselves as the one doing the aggressing.
Yes.
And that's important because while many of us were like, oh gosh, what would I do if that were to happen to me? The average aggressive felon is like, yeah, that's how I would handle my business.
Okay. Well, and we're way down on my list here, so I'll have to retcon basically. Is that the term? Yeah. I have.
That's retroactively correcting.
Oh, okay. So I have personally had, when I was young, two instances where I took advantage of that fact, almost cruelly, but I didn't have a problem with those guys anymore because one of them broke their hand on a cinder block wall. Um, which I got some, ironically, I got some respect knuckles from that guy in Dollar General, think back in January. Um, Men were weird. We can be enemies and then be friends the next day. It's weird. Okay. So the folks that, man, we're so too far ahead. The folks that Mike corresponded with, what you just described, sir, that's their mindset all the time. And for those of you that don't know about Medusa, it has three, and I'm not giving away trade secrets or anything because it's out there. There's three components, and it's all this. This is correspondence with supposed hard prisoners. It's shock, which is some kind of, which I jive with that. The Filipino in me, okay, I'm going to distract you for a minute. Latch, which is where you, at point blank range, mind you, grab onto the person and you don't let go, and then 3, stab. Relentlessly without targeting super general zones, okay? That's Medusa in a nutshell. And yeah, it's a disambiguation, but what you just described is the mindset of these gentlemen. Well, sir, that is something I'm always counting on, is that you're going to just try and bully your way through this thoughtlessly, carelessly. I'm relying on, I'm like, yes, yes, please grip your little knife in reverse while I pull out something 4 times as big, dance around you, and remove things. I'm I'm so down with that.
Well, I think I can't speak for them, not being one of them, but I
Mhm.
think their counter for that would be, it's all well and good for you to think you're going to do that, but this is all happening very quickly and very aggressively. And
Yes,
we know for a fact that in general, even among people with no training and no skills, the most aggressive person who moves the fastest is generally going to come out on top.
that's
So
right.
I think they're counting on, like, it would be a very rare confluence of factors, that only rarely are you going to meet an individual that won't work against that strategy. So I think what they're targeting is, this is the simplest way to give the most number of people the best chance of
Okay.
overwhelming potentially deadly force.
Well, something there's an attitude, and that what you're describing is an attitude of something you're very well acquainted with, going back to the forums in the 90s, probably. Nothing works in self-defense.
Yeah.
And this is almost a direct quote, sadly. Well, I watched this video of this move, and I don't know anything about the body mechanics involved with that, and I can't really garner that just by looking at it. But I tried to do that for 5 minutes, and I couldn't get it to work, so it doesn't work in 5 minutes of practicing. We are also it kind of plays on a magic pill. Well, we're a magic pill society. We all want the gold without working for it. It's the American way, or it's partially the American way, and the ease and accessibility of everything aided by technology has not helped that. Well, there isn't any magic pill where skills are concerned. Period. Um, and you can't train will either. It's something every individual has to decide long before such a thing happens, and set it like a stone in your heart so it'll be there, no bones about it. It's not something that we find like a ray of sunshine in the middle of a fight. No, it's there, it's ready to have the cloth pulled away to reveal it. There is no magic pill, and willpower in that circumstance has to be cultivated just as much as skills do. So I don't think you can hand someone a manual and say, do these 3 things or 5 things, or just here's a basic knowledge base. You've still got to put in the time. And
Yeah, you've got to practice, you've got to apply it. Even if you're just training on a body opponent bag, that's better than
yeah,
nothing. I just think it would be better to have a person. But there's a set of aphorisms that goes with the concept you're describing. Just because something didn't work doesn't mean it doesn't work. And just because something did work doesn't mean it does. And
yeah,
so, when you get like a hapless Wing Chun practitioner duck walks his way into a mixed martial arts ring, and the mixed martial arts guy comes out and looks at everybody like, really? And then proceeds to just destroy that guy. Is that proof that Wing Chun doesn't work? Well, for one thing, we have to define, what do you mean by work? Is it good for mixed martial arts competition? Probably not, because it's very weak when it comes to ground grappling. But does that mean you couldn't use things you learned in Wing Chun to actually defend yourself from someone on the street? You actually can, and I should know because I've done it. So, there's all these different ways that people look at nothing works, and there are certain self-defense instructors who sort of staked out that territory of telling you, not only does nothing work unless I told you it should, but you'll go to jail no matter what you do for any reason.
yeah,
And
yeah.
actually, it's not too far from the truth. I've talked before about Jared Ha, who used a karambit to defend himself from a guy who was beating him into the pavement. He did everything right. He used only the amount of necessary force. The guy did not die. And yet Jared Ha was a couple of jury votes away from going to prison. He only got acquitted by the barest of margins. And, he almost didn't. And it's terrifying to think that a justified use of force, especially showing the restraint that he showed, could still put you in that proximity to the rest of your life is over. I think as part and parcel of that, when you're learning a system that is based on overwhelming and destroying an opponent and is focused on maximum efficacy, to sort of paraphrase Deadpool, you really need to stop and consider, what am I ingraining into myself from a legal standpoint? Because especially when you can have an entire self-defense altercation caught on video where, the bodega worker used a knife to defend himself, the whole thing was on camera. And yet the miserable DA in Manhattan still wanted to put that guy in prison for defending himself. The same guy wanted to charge a man with illegal handgun possession because the guy took a gun away from the dude who had shot him and used it to defend himself. So the DA wanted to charge him with illegally possessing that weapon. Well, that's how psychotically insane that man is.
Okay, well, though, thank you for bringing this up. Now I don't have to. I had some super sly way I was going to nicely go into this. I'll try and just link my video from my page where I explain my use and the integration of reverse edge methodology and why, but should I give a super brief overview of that right here, right now? Because otherwise people won't know okay. So
go ahead.
Okay. So in Raven, I'm if you come to a class with me and you want to learn knives, the first thing you're probably going to learn is a super close hubud drill. Not this hubud drill, this hubud drill. Because it's, well, number one, the reverse edge methodology is incredibly confidence building. And just for the purpose of the exercise and the purpose of getting comfortable, you're kind of breaking through a lot of barriers and you're in bad breath range. Please brush your teeth though. But you are, okay, and you're getting comfortable, and it's sort of the crash course, and we all get to know each other that well, But you're also learning at that range, and this is the Aikido coming through. If I'm aiming, and I don't let people aim over here, or that's not hubud. No, you aim for that person's face with glasses on, and either they redirect you and they move, or they get tapped. We're going to really do this to, kindly. So also at that range, you learn to feel integrating with someone's force and turning it aside. So you're learning like 10 things at once. And just from feeling it, from very little actual instruction. Okay, well, as I have said, if you and I, Phil, both have the same size knife, and I want to have a little bit more reach than you do, am I going to do this or am I going to do this? Well, I'm probably going to do this.
I do think the concept of reach is obviated by proximity, and real fighting of this type is two people on top of each other. It's not two people dancing around in and out of range, able to control the range and the methodology.
Well, let me tell you, because let me tell you what I grew up with. Yeah, the paring knife fad that was popularized by a certain individual, that's not all people of that culture. I grew up with that culture. They use all kinds of tools and like all kinds of tools, the good and the bad, even including just for personal defense. They like the tools that they use every day. And so that's not just little paring knives that are ditchable. That's boning knives that are slender with big rubber handles because they all work at the chicken plant and that's what they get. They like breaking knives, big butcher knives. Okay. But unless you're using a criminal methodology to ambush an unarmed person, which is what I'm getting to, someone that range doesn't matter because they have no knife and you're surprising them, that's when people do this. That's why the criminals that you're talking to, okay.
Well, there has been a proliferation recently of videos of guys essentially doing bloody Brazilian knife fighting. That old book by It's like Uncle Fester and company, where they're essentially
Okay.
they're using their left hands to block with, and there's a lot of this very stiff reverse grip stuff, and it's two guys essentially dueling each other. I've seen several videos of that just recently making the rounds.
Okay. Well, anyway, it takes one in forward grip. Okay. You might stand there 7 seconds to 10 seconds before you faint, but forward grip is okay. The fad and its perception due to the popularization of criminal methods because of, frankly, seemingly guys trying to be cool has taken over. But culturally, which is apparently which goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the real element of cultural knife work that I grew up with, the good and the bad, is forward grip, larger knives. Yes, okay, you're not gonna want to stay latched to someone, for instance, and this is why it's a part of Raven. Well, for instance, yeah, no kidding, man. If someone's actively stabbing you, it is real hard to grab their hand. I wouldn't ever recommend that. But guess what part of your body is not moving very much compared to the knife? So if I'm at that range, you very well can have done it, have trained it, it works, and work your way down. You can occupy the knife rather than, am I going to latch to someone while they're stabbing me and just have a shank fest? No.
I think we're getting dangerously close to comparing apples and oranges, though, because you're talking about a more advanced, more trained martial method, and the Medusa guys are talking about a very simple system that anyone can learn very quickly. Obviously, you could take that as a jumping off point to do more, train more, and amass more methods for dealing with a greater range of situations. But from a basic self-defense standpoint, I think it makes a lot of sense because, they didn't go to prisoners and ask for their input because they wanted to look cool. They did it because they wanted to find what was the most expeditious way of doing it.
I'm not talking about them.
And yeah, and the cool just kind of, there are people who do associate that along the way. I don't know how many people remember Dan Weber, but it was Dan Weber who actually encouraged me to start my website like 20 years ago or whenever it was, like in 2003. And Dan, he had a videotape from TRS, a company that still exists today. They do mostly physical products rather than like DVDs anymore. But TRS put out, it was a prison fighting system because Dan had been in prison. And the video is a little weird because Dan is a relatively small person compared to, like, they had this giant guy that he was doing techniques on, and then they brought in a pretty girl to spice up the video and had her do some of the techniques. I have seen Dan do disarms. I've seen some private tapes that he sent me where he was doing disarms against live blades. Like, the guy had skill. And then eventually made the decision to sort of leave the self-defense industry and kind of disappeared off the map. But obviously the marketing hook that TRS took was the prison thing, believing that that's what would draw people in. And then a lot of the stuff he was doing, was it a prison-based system? A lot of it was really Wing Chun oriented because he had some training in that. So your guess is as good as mine how much of it was from prison and how much of it wasn't. But that was definitely the marketing approach that the company took at the time. Yeah. So, and obviously they did it because they thought people would think it was cool.
Yeah, well, I wasn't talking about the Medusa. You know who I was talking about, probably. We all see those personalities where they're like an accountant or something, and they trying to, yeah.
And there's a lot of that mystique travels around in Piper circles because Piper supposedly originated as a criminal-based system. I mean, right down to I would use the term conceit. We use that term when it comes to sort of an affectation that is done for no other reason than that of image. And so the conceit of Piper is the popularization of Okapi ring pull knives, which were popularized among the people who theoretically were the progenitors of Piper, but there's no good reason for you to carry one now. The only reason they're so popular is because it's a link to that image. And I say this as someone who owns a shoebox full of them, so I have no room to talk.
Yeah,
but,
well, Cold Steel makes one for like $10 or less, and it's a decent knife. Just as
Yes,
a knife, it's a handy, work knife. I had one. I used it in the yard all the time. It's a good knife.
and it only took me several years to figure out how to close one easily.
I know it's if you're used to normal knives, it's really weird getting used to it.
The first few years I was trying to use two hands, and then I finally figured out, wait, if you just push against it with one hand, it works fine.
Yeah. Okay. So the preface for talking about Medusa was going to be this, and this is kind of a quote from something I told Mike when he was commenting on how complex and therefore kind of garbage this one practitioner's moves were, and that being part of his reason for wanting to make Medusa is that he wanted to take something and make it simple and accessible, which, by the way, I can't think of anything more forthright or oriented towards serving others in the martial arts community than that, which is why I told Mike when he sent me the first draft of the booklet, I was like, because of that first section, I was like, well, I'm down. This is awesome. Please carry on. But anyway, the point of all, and you may or may not disagree, tell me if you do, the point of all this, of all martial arts, is, in my opinion, self-preservation. And to me, the meaning of martial art does not mean UFC or anything like that. Martial means war. And art, to me, means, in kind of the classical Japanese sense, the ability to do it to someone else without it being done to you. Okay? That's the thing. That's martial arts. So I cannot, on one hand, talk about self-preservation and wanting to help people, and then and I'm not talking about the Medusa guys at all when I say this next part, and then either via hubris or short man syndrome, ego, or accountants trying to be the cool person, the cool kids with fruit knives and lachatas, do things and then advocate things that are adding additional layers of danger to what is already a terrible situation if you're unlucky enough to be in it. When teaching, our purpose should be, or this is what I do, sorry, my purpose is my compass. So like, I think of it like a sphere. There's your purpose, your mission statement or whatever, and then your methodology branches out from that, and then your actual moves and everything branch out from that. And what that forces you to do always is reconcile those three. So if you start teaching a move that its results are contradictory to your purpose, then you must dispense with it or be forced to acknowledge that, oh, maybe my purpose has changed without me even realizing it, or you've lost sight of your original purpose.
Okay, so I can't remember. I believe James Keating wrote an article about this a number of years ago, and I want to say it was about a bodyguard and a customer who got into an altercation, and I can't remember which one of them cut the other, but one of them had been trained in, let's call it FMA, but it might have been something different.
Okay.
But he was a trained knife-wielding martial artist, and he delivered a blow that, if I remember correctly, killed the other guy. And it was probably unnecessarily so, and this guy's life is forever screwed because he took the life of the other guy. And it was, if I remember the point of the article correctly, James Keating was very wisely pointing out that if the system you're learning is teaching you killing techniques, you also need to make sure you're not just blindly doing those, irrespective of legal restrictions on your behavior. And there are a whole lot of people. Having spent so many years of my life involved in the self-defense industry, having helped to write legal self-defense programs, interviewed legal experts on use of force. I once interviewed Massad Ayub on the requirements for castle doctrine. I was involved in the creation of a legal defense program for one of the sites that I've worked with over the years. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I helped them to design that thing and gather the information and put it together. So I'm very aware that there are very specific legal requirements for any lethal use of force. It astonishes me how many people arm themselves and don't consider any of those things, and then have the gall to act surprised when their actions put them in prison. There was the pharmacist who, an armed young man came into the pharmacy. The pharmacist very correctly intercepted him with a weapon, put him down. That was legal self-defense and completely moral, but then stood over him and shot him again, which crosses the line to, yeah, stood over him,
Oh my
shot him
God.
again. And the one thing you can't do, there are people who do warning shots and don't realize that a warning shot is a fast trip to prison because you can't do that.
No.
So, and there's many permutations on those themes where people simply don't understand use of force issues. So if you're training in a system that very efficiently and correctly teaches you how to mess up another guy's day forever, you have to temper that with an understanding of the law and the position that puts you in. Because yes, grabbing the guy and sewing machining him is the best way to take him down in many cases, but maybe you also go to prison for that.
Yeah.
So everything we do in self-defense has to be tempered with an understanding of the legal fallout that's going to happen. And I know that in the moment that's not sexy or exciting, but it's really important when you're staring down the barrel of going to prison for defending yourself.
Yes. And okay, you reminded me, I want to say something about, well, tell you what, you already mentioned Mr. Ha, Jared Ha, who I believe he was using, it was either the 479 or the 599, but the full Fox folding karambit. I had this.
Yeah, he had a karambit.
Yes, I had this thought that when I was rewatching Longmire, and does this happen to you where someone's getting assaulted and not like an armchair warrior, well, I would have done this, but like you have a visceral, like what you want to do to that person that's assaulting the helpless person? Does that happen to you?
What happens most often is they'll be locked up using their hands, and I'm like, why is neither of you kicking?
Oh, okay.
Because people don't think to use their feet.
Well, the kicking, that's the Kun Tao influence perhaps coming through with the footwork.
I don't think it's just that, though. I think anybody who has like integrated martial arts training, I remember when I was a beginner, integrating my hands and my feet was hard. I was used to using my hands, but not to using my feet. So I think anybody who does any self-defense system that involves any kind of low-line kicking at all eventually learns to integrate that. Like if my hands are occupied, maybe I get in a low-line kick or a knee.
Yeah.
So
anyway, there's a scene in, okay, I'll briefly set the scene. Some oil rig workers have been, and the oil rig is outside of Longmire's jurisdiction, which is what poses the problem. But these oil workers have been going onto the Indian reservation and raping young native women. And they've been getting away with it because it happens on the reservation. So there's a big jurisdiction thing. But anyway, Longmire's finding a way to pin them for it. And the oil rig, one of the executives is named Walker Browning, and he's perfectly played. The guy that plays him, really well done, super like sleazy. You love to hate this guy kind of guy.
Yeah, I don't remember the actor's name, but I can picture him.
That guy, like perfect picture. And anyway, he's just gonna rub out the girl that's gonna testify. He's gonna find her and kill her to save his guys. And so he doesn't know where this native woman has escaped to, but he knows her friend. And so he breaks into that woman's home and can't remember her name. But anyway, he breaks into her home and immediately starts thrashing her around. So he's broken into the home. He then makes a committed verbal threat that if you don't tell me where Gab is, I am going to kill you. So he's using a threat of violence to make someone do something. Legally, that's also kidnapping. And he's outright assaulting someone with deadly intent. So there's 3 automatic, and Wyoming is castle, you mentioned castle doctrine, that's what made me think. Wyoming is castle doctrine. So especially because she's a young woman and there's a discrepancy of force, she's well within her right to kill this guy. Anyway, when I saw that of her on the table and just getting any one of those headshots to the wall or floor or table could have killed her. My brain went little tiny folding karambit against an unarmed person. I'll circle back around to that. If it were me, if I were that young woman, karambit would have immediately come out just above the knee, all the way up, into the stomach, all the way up here, around here. Complete you know, because he's made the committed verbal threat. I'm going to kill you.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Well,
that's a
that's
great example.
exactly the Jared Ha case. That's what
Well,
happened to Jared Ha. He was on the ground. He was getting beaten on the ground, so he deployed that karambit to get the guy off him. It's the same thing.
Okay. In public, here's a great, for those of you that might want to use a small karambit, not so much for, again, going weapon to weapon with someone because you're using a tiny knife in reverse grip, unless you just like being slashed and or stabbed to death yourself, then by all means. But a good thing it's really great at is hamstring, Achilles, very kind of more surface targets. You get behind them and just rip them out. Rarely, if ever, deadly. They lose function. It's the weirdest thing. They lose function in their leg, and you're free to run, and they can't possibly follow you. So I like that use of tiny karambit. That's non-lethal.
Yeah, you again open yourself up to, like, you cut somebody's Achilles tendon and run from them. All of a sudden, you're getting sued by a guy who is now accusing you of very, very unfairly ruining his life, because that's the crazy system we have. You would, I mean, morally, yes, if he attacks you, he assumes a certain amount of risk. Legally, not so much. So.
Well, if it's notice what I said about the fourth component to Walker Browning should have died immediately.
Yeah.
The fourth component to that is that was a woman. Okay, Chris, being 6'2" and a man, 6'3" if I stand up straight, I would not, even in my home, I wouldn't do that unless he was armed. Just because, number one, I don't think it would necessarily feel right. And yeah, I'd probably be within my right if you surprise me like that. But you're probably going to catch a glass candle holder to the head. I'm not a helpless individual, relatively. So a woman in public could get away with something like that, whereas
she could
not.
Yeah, and I've told this to women that I've talked to about self-defense before. I said, you know, you can do things that I can't, simply because most people are going to look at you and see you automatically as the victim in a way that they would not if it was me involved. So that's to your advantage.
Okay, so perfect segue. And all of this has been leading to what I want to say about this aspect of Medusa. And I have a little blurb here, so it might take me a minute to read through it. Bear with me, please. I use Pical for training. It's confidence building, and it's a primal, brutal, effective method that everyone should have in their back pocket for the worst case scenario. Absolutely. I'm not contesting that. Basically, my opinion, if someone has the legal right to utilize a method of killing like that, meaning that the individual still has a knife or deadly weapon in their hand, then whatever grip that gentleman has it in, let's say hypothetically you, Phil, are waving even a small paring knife around in forward grip. I'm not going to want to engage with you in reverse grip. I feel like I will say that because I firmly believe it's the truth, and I've been there. I feel like the confidence instilled by reverse edge methods, especially to new practitioners, and the ease with which you can learn it, is kind of seen by some as a catch-all, end-all magic pill solution for any edged threat without any thought of your personal safety to your core and your neck. There has to be, one, a willpower factor behind it, right, to make it really effective. Two, which men arguably naturally have. Well, many of them. And two, it's very, very difficult to land a telling hit against an armed person without, again, in the martial arts sense, without you also getting stabbed. You have to be accurate. You have to be fast. You have to be, okay, now for you, Phil, that's easy. You're a many year Wing Chun practitioner, and that, as you say, dovetails super nicely with those close methods. In my opinion, it would, right?
Well, yeah, because you would be focusing on moving to the blind side of the opponent so that you're not in a position to be stabbed.
Right. Okay,
You
so
know,
that's
long before any kind of discussion of grip or who's in forward and who's in reverse, it's where's my body oriented.
yes, exactly. Thank you. So, and that's a component in Medusa, but if you're latched onto some, okay, it's kind of in stark contrast to that, and we're not even really carrying some. Okay, and I've already said that.
Well,
But
I
applying,
wouldn't assume I wouldn't assume that they don't. Like my assumption is when these folks get together to train, that positioning is probably integral to the practice. Like it's not one guy squared off with another guy, now latch onto him, now stab him. Like there's got to be, I'm assuming, a component of body positioning in the training and the practice, because otherwise there would be no training and practice to do.
right? I hope so. Well said. But anyway, so it's simple. It's one of the simplest things to learn, but applying it without having stabbing damage done to you is very, very, very hard because of how close you are and how fast you have to be. So because of that,
I
I would not want to hand especially a young lady that I care about who is at a physical disadvantage regarding those two components you have to have reverse edge work. I don't want to hand her a book that says this and then say, okay, go defend yourself. Number one, go defend yourself successfully against another armed person using the hardest thing to do without getting stabbed yourself in reality. Or two, face jail time in the rare instance that it is actually effective because you did it against an unarmed person. And that's kind of how you have to use it.
Yeah, I mean,
There, I said it.
if I felt that, I think the first assumption, you're very unlikely to face another armed attacker is my guess. I think in most of these scenarios, you're just dealing with a rando on the street who's probably not holding a butcher knife while he's speaking to you. In every self-defense scenario, including the ones that I've described in podcasts before that actually really happened, there was no weapons. The other people didn't have weapons. I did. I described in one case a couple of people who came at me outside of a movie theater late at night in an empty parking lot, and I was the one with the knife. Whether or not they saw it, I don't know. But as soon as I got ready to go to work, the two of them took a right-hand turn and went in a different direction. So either they were like, "This is a bad situation, and I'm about to get mugged," and I'm like, "Haha, joke's on you, counter mugging," or they really did mean
Or yeah, it's like
and
call
the
an
second
ambulance, but not for me.
right, but not for me.
Yeah.
So it may have been that, or it may have been that, it really was what I thought it was. And they're like, oh, no, he's aware. We go in another direction. There was another incident that happened just last year where a guy was clearly trying to mug me outside of a bookstore, which really, that was what I was most offended by. I'm like, really? A suburban bookstore? I can't even go to Barnes and Noble.
No,
But that whole time, like I had a knife and I was contemplating getting it ready. He did not, or at least not that I saw, and he never went for one. So, yes, if you deploy a knife in a situation where the other person is not visibly armed, you might be in trouble or you might not, because if I went for my knife, it would be because I felt like there was disparity of force, like he's much bigger or there's more of him than me, you know. He's got several identical twins. It's a Mr. Multiplicity sort of situation. Um, you know.
it's Dr. Manhattan or something. Yeah.
Yes. So
Who ironically lives in Manhattan.
Like I think part A of our assumptions is probably you're not dueling someone. It's not two people with knives. And then part B would be if I'm deploying a weapon, it's probably because I have good reason to. But again, that's all going to vary depending on the situation. We could construct hypothetical scenarios all day.
Okay, well, I can tell you about 10 that are not hypothetical, and they happen a lot in the parking lot of a building just down the street from me. Duels do happen, and they're
They
not
do, but
with small, tiny knives. And so you're
yeah,
either,
I tend to think though, duels happen, but I tend to think they're a lifestyle choice. Like those guys, when you see, I've seen video of dudes with machetes, probably not in the United States, but maybe, guys fighting each other with machetes in the streets of some city. Pretty sure those guys both decided I'm doing this, and it wasn't a random mugging sort of situation where you've got miscreant and civilian. I think when these guys rolled up their characters, they were both bad guys. So,
well, we like to, and that's interesting. We like to highlight people. Okay, these guys are blue and they're the bad guys, and these guys are, or I'm going to highlight you
Yeah.
pink. You're a good guy. No, okay. Some things are part and parcel, for better or worse, of a at least subsets of a culture.
Yeah.
That you have, when I walk out my door, like I have since I was 16, I'm carrying as much and as big a piece of steel as I possibly can, at least.
And I don't disagree. I'm just saying that while the possibility of a duel does exist, by duel I mean two guys both armed. I
Mhm.
just think if that's happening to you a lot, it's a lifestyle choice.
Okay. Anyway, uh, my phone is on 2%, so it went to dim, so I can't see it. Oh, yeah, okay. So the timeline, let's say best case scenario, you somehow avoid being stabbed to death yourself, and it's in Medusa style. You've latched onto the criminal that latched onto you, and you successfully eliminated the threat, in the sense that on your third stab, that guy dropped the knife. Remember what you just said about the guy that was on the ground? Okay. And also, like, if you shoot someone and they fall to the ground, drop their gun, you cannot continue to shoot them. That's how that
That's
works.
true.
So, and you might say, oh, it was the heat of the moment. Listen, if you're a professional, especially if you got a license to protect, or if you care about being not in jail, period, you have to assume that every dim damn thing you do, and first off, assume there's always cameras, but assume that it will be analyzed to the max of on camera. Well, you stabbed him once past when he dropped the knife.
Yes.
We
People
got
who
you. You
have the
have to
luxury of
assume that that's,
time,
yeah,
yeah, people who have the luxury of time will microanalyze everything you did in excruciating detail.
yeah.
And if you don't hold back, and it would be very easy to not hold, but you're fighting for your life. You're stabbing a guy who's trying to kill you, and the second you realize he's no longer stabbing me, well, you'd better hope that that's the moment he stops aggressing and not before that.
Hmm.
They taught us in one class I took with Insights, I think it was. They taught us to as you're cutting the other person to shout, "Stop! You're cut! Stop! You're cut!" The idea being that in the adrenaline of an encounter, people don't even
Oh, yeah.
realize they're taking damage.
I remember
So
you
that
telling
works
me that. I
both
think
ways.
didn't you write an article for Blade magazine or something on using that in a fight as a?
It wasn't Blade. It would have been like Tactical Knives magazine or something
Okay.
like that. But the instructor of that particular course was John Holshine, I think.
Okay.
It was a long time ago now, and he's still around. He still does his thing.
Okay. So anyway, so I asked you probably a month ago now, why do you think Mr. Keating is as popular as he is, even with guys that are kind of brutal and like to say, "Oh, that's weird, man." And your answer was very simply, within 5 seconds, you shot back, because he's one of the nicest guys in the industry and has been for a long time. And so talking about the attitude, I've discussed this with you privately, and that's my concern with a lot of personalities, is that they might have material that's worth reading, that's worth investing a lot of time in. You can be selling gold bars, and if you got a bad attitude, if you don't, then no one's going to buy your bars. But if you're James Keating selling some stuff that most people consider kind of weird, but you're still the nicest guy in the world, you're going to have business forever.
Yeah, his website used to have all kinds of cool like UFO stuff and other
Oh, really?
weird,
I didn't know that.
interesting. Oh yeah, he's I don't know if he still maintains that particular website or not.
Hmm.
But years he's always been the nicest guy. He's really cool. He's very knowledgeable. You put all that together, it's a formula for everybody likes him. I don't know if I've ever heard from anyone who had a bad word to say about Jim Keating. Now there may very well be people who don't like him. I've never personally interacted with any of them. That's not the same for, there's lots of other personalities in this industry who make enemies, who pick fights, who have an attitude. Some of it deserves, some of it not. Like, it runs the gamut. I myself, as you get older, you discover there's things you could have been wrong about. There's different ways of doing things. So there's a lot of guys in the industry who started out as very belligerent, and that's how they made their name. And they've kind of, gotten, everyone, as they get older, they either get more mellow or they get more grumpy, and some of them just get nuts. Some of them get a little bit crazy. There's a few guys in the CLOT/FMA world who, as they get older, are just a little out there. Not in a bad way, just you read their post and you're like, okay, moving on. So, yes, your point is well taken that having a belligerent attitude is the sort of thing that might have ramifications you haven't even considered. Like having that, positioning yourself as that belligerent, bellicose guy might end up hurting you later, whereas positioning yourself as a super nice guy probably doesn't have a downside. There was one guy that I interviewed once about knife fighting, and he gave a very good interview about the viciousness of knife fighting and all this other stuff. And then his ex turned around and used that article against him in a custody hearing. Which was something I had never considered.
Oh, yeah.
And when I found out that happened, I was like, whoo, boy. It's like,
okay.
It's almost one of those meme faces. It's like,
no, it's a meme.
Well.
Yeah. Is it Homelander who's like,
yes, the Homelander meme, like,
yeah. Which, okay, talking about Mr. Keating, which by the only reason I had heard his name here and there, but I never looked him up. I think Lynn Thompson mentioned him, and I love Lynn. But someone called me like a discount James Keating or something like that because of my. So I was forced.
James Keating from Wish.
Yeah, I'm Wish Keating. Yeah. But anyway, it's okay. So obviously, I'm a proponent of big blades. And speaking of Lynn Thompson and cold steel, if you don't want to carry around a Bowie, and I understand that. I'm from Arkansas. I am literally down the road from the birthplace of the Bowie knife. It is our state bird, okay? I understand that you don't want to lug around a knife that big. Well, this is a trainer for the cold steel Talwar. See how big that is? Okay, so you can carry, and these are light knives that Cold Steel makes, by the way. They didn't pay me to say this. I'm just a big fan. These fold. They fold. They don't even need a sheath, so it's that big. It's in your purse, and this is not all blade like a Bowie, but watch that. You see how much reach you've got? Okay, that's my plug. I just want to say, if you don't want to carry around a Bowie, and the Talwar's kind of pricey, but the Voyager series are very affordable. That's all I wanted to say. And moving on, unless you have something you want to add to that. I'm really short on time.
Well, it's probably a topic for another podcast, but there's a big argument to be made. You can make a powerful argument for large blades. There's an equally compelling argument to be made for smaller blades as having more applicability in extreme close quarters. But then we touched on that.
Yes, absolutely. I think of it like I wouldn't use a pocket pistol. I wouldn't use a .32 Tomcat to try and nail a guy that's way down, right? Okay, and you wouldn't.
Right, but you'd use it if he was already in your face and you wanted to put it up under his chin and ruin his day.
Yeah, so each tool to its own thing. Yeah, I'm not anti-small blade. So I have some friends I grew up with and some people I've gained over the years who are friends who are now retired prison officers, as well as current prison officers, like up to the maximum security level. I asked them specific questions before this talk. Here's what they told me. Their experience has been, and they all said, strangely, they all said the same thing. One's in Oklahoma, one's in Little Rock, one's several in Texas. So maybe this is a southern thing, I don't know. Most weapons are actually batteries in a sock, like deadly weapons, because the only outlet to be found in a prison is going to be at the guard area for their TV and stuff. You can't have them. Okay, so all your stuff has to use batteries. If you have a Walkman or something, they save the old batteries. Put them in a sock. And most actual shank or knife attacks, and by most I mean all of them, I said, do you mean all? They said, yes, everyone I've ever seen. And one of them's like a 20-year person. Are power plays between either made up organizations within the prison, some made up hierarchy, or an external group.
Yeah.
It's a power play between rival organizations, and they are always 3 or 4 guys on one. That's the only time in which shanks or edged weapons are used. The rest of the time, it's improvised weapons, and it's most commonly batteries in a sock. Okay, well, here's another. I'm not going to want to latch on to one fella while 3 others are going to do me in. Okay, that's my. So this has your ability to create some space and some range. And if you don't recognize your own mortality and that all it takes is one nick right here and you're done, you're out. If you don't recognize that and you just want to use the super powerful with no thought of what's going to happen to you, see how that can be a disadvantage? If you want to do that, then you probably will die. You might kill the other guy, but you will also probably die.
It's probably worth a follow-up interview with the Medusa guys to ask them about how they would handle multiple opponents. When I interviewed them, it never occurred to me to ask that specific question, one about multiple attackers. And
Okay.
I'd be very interested to hear their answer, because I would be willing to bet they have one. You know, it may very well be that the calculus is, if I'm dealing with multiple people, you know, I'm hitting, I'm grabbing, I'm stabbing, and I'm moving on to the next guy as quickly as I possibly can, sort of mowing my way through them, very much aware of the fact that I can't linger. But I couldn't speak for them. You'd have to ask them.
Yeah. Okay, well, I might just do that. I think that's fair. And so this was interesting. I don't know. Closing thoughts?
Well, there is a desire for decisive finality in any topic when it comes to martial arts and self-defense. Everyone wants an answer that is a mic drop moment. And I don't know if there's actually many of those to be had. You know, even something as simple as forward or reverse grip, something that used to seem really important, especially when I was reading my first books on knife fighting, when I first started buying those and people cared about what grip you were using and what orientation. 20 years down the road, it's like, I don't know if that's actually all that important compared to like body position. So while we all want an end-all be-all answer and, like you said, a magic pill, there really aren't any. So it really comes down to this continuum of how much did you learn and how much are you going to learn and how are you going to apply it?
Yeah. Very well said. Life, everything's about balance to me. And so, yeah, you have to find the balance between all these things, and all these things within the context, within the right context, everything can potentially have value. And so if you're always working on all your skills, then when that situation arrives, then you're more likely to apply it correctly.
I would love to hope that we're witnessing the birth of a new system that's going to be around for a good long while, and that foundational discussions like these are going to be very interesting to paw through later. So
Hey, remember when?
Yeah. I mean, a little bit of who gets to witness that, the birth of something new in a field where it almost seems like, well, it seems like there's never anything new, and yet there's constantly new things. You know, a few years ago, I was not aware of like Libre fighting. A few years before that, I was not aware of Piper. You know, and you can keep going. You can keep naming things. It just, stuff comes along.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is Phil Elmore and Wish Keating signing off. Thank you for being with us. Bye.
Still a compliment.
I guess so. Yeah, he's cool. All right, bye.
Even being the discount version, still a compliment.
Okay, I'll take it.